All right.
How's he doing?
We'll get started. Oh my gosh. Hang on. Okay. To the folks online, I apologize. You will not be getting a visual. Maybe that is something I should say you're welcome about. But anyway, cool. Well, you'll get this. Anyway, so Don came in with an icebreaker ready. And so his icebreaker was to tell us your name and what your first car, make, model, and color was. Right?
Or at least your first car and color, maybe.
Okay.
You know, not one you got for
You
your
can
parents.
remember.
Okay.
I can remember.
Okay. Well, and since Don suggested it, I'm going to suggest that he go first because he's probably thought about it. Hopefully it doesn't require too much space.
1977 American Motors Gremlin, and it was chartreuse.
Wow. So that's why you asked this question, because you had a really good answer. Hey, Aquetta, welcome.
I had, I can't remember the very first one because I didn't have it for very long, it was red. The second one was the one that I really liked, which was a white Datsun E210, which of course they don't make anymore, obviously. So that would be it, and I don't know what year. Nope.
So Aquetta, we are sharing name and then our first car and at least the color or whatever you remember about it.
So my first car was an Honda Accord. Her name is Baby. She lasted for 20 years.
Wow. Honda.
And she was like that brownie gold. And when I see a
It was a really long time ago.
My name's Doug, and I had a 1991 Chevy S10 that was red. It was 13, 14 years old when I bought it, so I'm not that old.
Alright, my first car was a red four-door Volkswagen Box. It only made, I think, for about 4 years. Volkswagen, it was similar to just but smaller. And it was red. It was in 1989. I bought it in the year 2000. So it was already
Awesome.
16, or no, already 11 years old.
Nice.
And it, again, lasted another at least 10 years. I made way for the oldest car. 1972, and it was new, so you know how old it was. In 1972, Plymouth Satellite Sebring, red with a white top and a white interior.
Ooh, nice.
Sebring convertible.
It was fun. No, it was very good.
I'm Mike, and my first car was in 1956.
Oh!
And it was two colors, but I can't remember what either of them were.
Oh my gosh.
My first car was a Dodge Dart, and it was 1960. And the only thing I remember about it is it consumed 1 quart of oil per 100 miles. So I had to have a case of oil in my trunk at all times.
I had a car like that. Yep.
I'm Godwin, and my first car was a Toyota Tercel.
Okay.
Like, nothing spectacular.
Nice.
My name's Janine, and my first car was some sort of Honda. I have no idea what year it was, but I do remember it.
Nice. I like it.
My name is Kim, and my first car was a Buick. It was a brown tank. I don't know what day.
Yeah. Cambria, we're sharing our names in our first car.
My name is Cambria, and I have not owned a first car.
I wondered. Nice. All right. I had not either. My first car that was given to me came from my paternal grandfather's wife, and it was a red Honda Prelude 2-door that was older than I was, but in okay shape. The first car that I bought myself was a 2001 Subaru Outback LL Bean Edition with wood paneling on the side. It was my dream car, and we lost it to a broken drive shaft in that epic snowstorm where we got 14 inches of snow because I had to drive back from the mountains, but it got me back, so RIP old cars. Well, welcome, and many of y'all have been here for most, if not all, of our sessions so far, and this is our last in this series, so this is week 6 of our Go Deep for this fall. And tonight we're talking about Christian nationalism, and we're going to define some terms in a second. But I've been doing some real cheerful reading this week in preparation for tonight, and there are a number of different directions we can go. I've got some stuff to share, but then we can just discuss. And again, if folks are online, you won't have video of us, but you'll have the slides. So there are a number of terms that will come up that it's important to just kind of talk about. So religious nationalism, broadly, it has to do often with establishing a religion by the state. And this happens in a lot of different religions. So there are Christian nationalists, there are Buddhist nationalists, there are Muslim nationalists. So pretty much any religion, you can find some kind of religious nationalism. Christian nationalism, of course, is the Christian version of that, but it has particular forms that have shown up throughout history. And we really are mostly going to be talking about white Christian nationalism in America, sort of in the last century. But just to note that it has shown up in a lot of different ways, including in Nazi Germany. There were German Christians who were a part of Hitler's Germany. White nationalism is about establishing an ethno-state that's, is a racist ideology. So you'll see neo-Nazis, skinheads, etc. today. not skinheads against racial prejudice. There is a subset of skinheads who are explicitly against racial prejudice, and I know some of them, so I feel the need to name that. But and then we get white Christian nationalism is kind of the merging of Christian nationalism and white nationalism. And in America, a lot of what we see going on right now, there are some folks who might fall more into one camp or the other, but there is a lot of overlap and entanglement because of how this country was founded, because of how our politics work. And I am not an expert on any of this, just not an expert really on much of what we've talked about, but the point is for us to have a conversation about what we understand and how we respond. So a lot of what Christian nationalism in this country tries to claim is that America was established as a Christian nation and that we need to reclaim and assert that at the governmental level. Now, some of the founding fathers were Christian, some of them really weren't. They were escaping religious persecution. The First Amendment and the Establishment Clause is a key part of our Constitution. The Establishment Clause says that the government shall not establish any religion. The state doesn't get to tell people what religion is authorized or required in this nation. So there's been a lot of revisionist history trying to claim that we've always been a Christian nation. Yeah, Gloria, you probably have thoughts on
The
this.
federal government shall not.
Yes.
There were state governments who established religion up until the 1830s.
Okay.
Massachusetts did until the 1830s. They were the last one.
Okay.
But the South was absolutely against established religion.
Interesting. So you'll note that we have things like our money says, "In God we trust." The Pledge of Allegiance has this "Under God" clause. These are things that were added in the 1950s. So I know that, for a long time I just assumed that this was always, this was our motto as Americans. But really our longest standing motto is "E pluribus unum," from many one. But in the 50s, and I read a very tedious book about this that I can recommend with caveats, but this was part of an effort to sort of more explicitly put religion into the government and to assert basically America as a Christian nation. A lot of this, particularly around money, is very much tied up with corporate America and reactions against the New Deal and fears about communism. There's so much there that we won't totally get into, but just know that these are things that I thought just had always been the case, but really have come to be in the last century. And then even in some interesting, there are a number of court cases that come up over time about prayer in schools and other issues of religious liberty, and the courts will sometimes cite things like "In God We Trust" as if it were ancient American, not that there is ancient America of this country, of this nation's history, but it is very recent history, and that's important to know. So I found just, yeah.
Something, a comment on that. Bible reading in the schools was common in the 19th century. And it was always the Protestant Bible. And so a lot of historians say that de facto Protestantism was the established religion in the United States. And there are famous examples. There's a famous example of a boy in New York City, a child, who refused to read from the King James Bible because he was Catholic. Yep. And he had to go up, and then the teacher caned his wrist with a stick. And then that was taken to court, and the court said it was okay.
Yes, yeah. So it's
Really
not
bad.
just, the history is not just of non-Christians saying there's a problem with this, but even like within Christianity. I read about that in this book, and it had not occurred to me that, of course, the King James Bible is a Protestant translation, and is, for Catholics, they don't read it. So yeah, that was a recurrent issue, and there's a lot of question about, folks saying, oh well, if we teach all of these other things, we should teach religion, but then there's always this question of, are we teaching religion or are we instilling devotion? And we're establishing Protestantism and not, if we were trying to do this with Islam, there would be an outcry, right? There's clear favorability around Protestantism in this country. This is just some interesting, because I love a bar graph. But most people, if you ask them if Christian nationalism is constitutional, they'll say no. It's pretty clear. The Establishment Clause is in there. There have been efforts to amend the Constitution to basically change this. But even though most folks believe that Christian nationalism is unconstitutional, it is still popular, particularly on the right. And so this is one of these issues that is very polarized politically between people who identify as Democrat and Republican. This issue also breaks down along generational lines. I think none of this is necessarily surprising. Both generational and political. Basically, do you want to declare the U.S. a Christian nation? You get more from older generations in general, and much more for Republicans than Democrats. This was an interesting statistic from the same study. So they studied white grievance. And so this is the idea that white people are being persecuted in America. And so roughly 59% of all Americans who say white people have been discriminated against a lot more in the past 5 years favor declaring the U.S. a Christian nation, compared to 38% of all Americans. So this is where we get in this intersection of Christianity, whiteness, and nationalism. And Anthea Butler, her book, White Evangelical Racism, specifically looks at this, and she notes that we often think about kind of the religious right, and we assume that abortion is the issue that they sort of coalesced around in the 70s, but she really argues that race was at the center of what started to motivate this. And when you see these numbers breaking down so thoroughly by race, that's kind of hard to deny that it's absolutely at work. So as we're talking about the intersections of Christian nationalism, white evangelicalism, it's all complicated and very political. So one book, I have not finished reading this yet, but Carter Hayward is a priest and scholar who's actually from Charlotte, North Carolina, lives in the North Carolina mountains. And she just put out this book called The 7 Deadly Sins of White Christian Nationalism. And so these are the 7 sins that she names. One is lust for omnipotence, and she talks about power as power over people, which we talked about in our very first session in this series, the distinction between power over and power with. She talks about entitlement, this sense of, this nation is ours, we deserve X, Y, Z. White supremacy, of course. She names misogyny as a core element, capitalist spirituality, domination of the earth, and violence.
What does capitalist spirituality mean?
I just got to that chapter, so I can't explain it deeply, but there are Christians who claim that capitalism is like a divinely ordained economic system, and that, so this is some of what you get with symptom, not cause. But basically the idea, it aligns with prosperity gospel that says that if, when God blesses you, you make a lot of money, and, poor people are probably poor because of some sin. There's a lot in there, but capitalist spirituality basically treats our economic system as something that God approves of and participates in.
So these people, have you ever read Dickens?
There's probably a lot that they haven't read, but and I don't know. It just is prosperity gospel is definitely in there. And some of this too emerged again from this reaction to the New Deal and fear around communism and the Red Scare. So like capitalism is treated as this morally superior system to communism. Well, the communists are godless. So clearly, we're a Christian nation, we're capitalist. So these things are good and they go together, basically. So any thoughts on any of these things? Yeah, go ahead.
There is an interesting connection between capitalism and spirituality in the period of industrialization in the North, in the 1850s and 1860s. It was not uncommon for factories to only hire long-term people who belonged to a church. And so there's a kind of a union of the church and capitalist business interest very early in our history. It's like they saw Christianity and the Christian church as kind of a disciplining, stabilizing mechanism. And if you wanted to have stability in your life, then you had to join a church so you could get a regular job and have regular income, so that you could support your family.
Yeah.
So this goes back pretty far in American history, and I think that it's not surprising that people end up confusing the two. Because, you know, when you read the Gospels, you don't have much sense that Jesus is advocating capitalism. I never got that impression.
Right. But there are, I mean, like with anything, there's scripture that gets used to argue for capitalism and prosperity and all of this. And there is a lot of history around evangelical preachers sort of preaching against unions and labor rights, which is, Methodism has a long history of being for labor rights, but Billy Graham loved to tell people to just obey their employers and not to unionize, among others. It just happens to be a prominent local one.
Another connection might be imperialism.
Yes.
Which has there's a real close connection between Christian missionaries and capitalist economic expansion abroad. And I know about this more from Britain because my mother's English. So she went to a parochial school in the 20s and 30s. It was Anglican, a girls' school for poor girls. It was actually a charity school. And she came out with an understanding of Christianity that has nothing to do with Jesus. It was like, for her, religion was Proverbs. It was the religion of white people. People who do not believe in the Christian God were heathens, regardless of their race. And I never heard her utter the word Jesus in her entire life. I mean, in the entire relationship I had with her, 70 years, I never heard her say the word Jesus. It was a religion of, I think Proverbs is really, kind of like, that's what I associate with my mother. It's like adages. These are like norms and standards of behavior and standards of spread the rod, spoil the child kind of stuff. So that's what Christianity was for her. It had nothing to do with Jesus.
Interesting.
And that's what she learned in this Anglican school.
Yeah.
And I suspect that would maybe be common in the United States too.
Yeah, and there, even with some of this, there are interesting studies around, people identifying as Christian but not actually participating in Christian community. There's actually a lot. I haven't looked at it super recently, but some of the more sort of extremist views come about when you're not actually engaged in a church or faith community. So some of it is preached by religious leaders, but some of it is kind of taking the political and semi-moral elements, and then it becomes something different. Any other thoughts on these things? Yeah. Well, I mean, we can see that with, I've got a couple examples of white nationalist violence that has happened, and they'll be all things that you probably heard about. But some of these folks have been motivated by something called the Great Replacement Theory, which is the idea that white people are being replaced by ethnic minorities, non-Christians, etc. And the only reason that would be concerning is if you felt entitled to a position of power and influence. And so this idea that as white people, we are superior, we deserve this kind of access, position, etc. To claim that your religion is the one that should be established by the state, that is entitlement, right? So that was a not very scholarly answer to that question, but I think that's...
Another thought is that in societies where a majority is of one religion, and this is true in Burma, as it is true in the United States, people tend to confuse their own culture with religion. They don't draw a distinction. And so like people in Burma, they don't really know what Buddhism is. They think it's their culture. And so if that means, if their culture says, be violent against this minority, that's Buddhism for them.
Yeah.
Even though, we would think, that doesn't seem like Buddhism to me. But so in a society where Christians or some other group is a minority, they're more likely to be conscious of what's distinctive about their religion. But in a society where they're the majority, they're more likely to have a very unclear understanding what the difference between their own culture is and the religion. Another
Right.
famous example of this is with clitorectomies,
Mhm.
where societies where most people are Muslim and they have a certain custom related that requires this, they think that's part of Islam when it really isn't.
Yeah, and that goes back to some of what we talked about last week about colonialism, which both goes to the entitlement piece and the confusing of white Western culture with Christianity as essentialized, when Christianity is necessarily transcends ethnic, national boundaries, but it gets claimed by groups in ways that tend to deny that. So the last piece of violence, and this is something that I think more attention is getting paid to how white Christian nationalist violence is really a huge threat. People will say to national security, to black and brown people in America, and there are a lot of different examples. So Buffalo, New York, this was just this May, 10 were killed. This was the shooter who bought into the Great Replacement theory that white people are being replaced. El Paso, Texas, 23 killed at a Walmart there. This was the largest act of violence in a Latino community. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 11 dead at the Tree of Life Synagogue in October 2018. Charleston, South Carolina, June 2015, 9 killed at Mother Emanuel, AME Zion. Oak Creek, Wisconsin, August 2012, 7 dead in a Sikh temple there. And then I'm just going to pause, and then I've got some images from January 6th. But so it'll always be too soon. So these are all mass shootings, and we talk about gun violence, we talk about anti-black violence, and this was targeted against black people, targeted against brown people, targeted against Jewish people, targeted against black people, targeted against Sikh people who, especially after 9/11, are often confused for Muslims, and just sort of general anti-Arab violence that happens. So with white Christian nationalism, you get supremacy that is operating at a level that many different people groups become targets, including people of all different religions, black and brown people perceived as foreign. And so all of these highlight, really sadly, Valerie Carr's book, See No Strangers, she talks a lot about this shooting, and it just brought to my attention how I didn't pay very much attention to anti-Sikh violence, which there was just another shooting in Merced, California, where 4 were killed. But there's been a lot of violence against the Sikh community, especially since 9/11. January 6th, there was a lot of white Christian imagery at the Capitol. So here we've got white Jesus in a MAGA hat. We had people praying at a cross on the lawn. In the Capitol, people holding Bibles and crosses and scripture. And you can, January 6th, it was a mix of people, right? But there was a lot of anti-Semitic language. There was a lot of racist language. There were white Christian nationalists. There were white nationalists. But white Christians need to especially...
I haven't seen those pictures before. They aren't commonly shown in media, are they? That's interesting.
It depends on where you're looking, I think.
Oh, okay. So where were these pictures from?
An article about white Christian nationalists on January 6th. I'll have to find the exact, I can't remember the exact resource because I was looking at it.
They're kind of shocking, actually.
Yeah. Well, and that cross was there most of the day, I think. So there are a number of images with that cross on the lawn. So I deconstructing and naming the evil is always great, but what I actually love about Carter Hayward's book is that she corresponds each of the deadly sins that she names with calls to action, basically of antidotes, of ways to counteract these. So let's see if I can actually remember the 7 deadly sins, but the lust for omnipotence, the call to action is to empower one another. So instead of using power over exercising power with, and uplifting one another. The antidote to entitlement is embodying humility. And, for some of us, that might be cultural humility, looking at the ways in which we embody certain kinds of privilege and counteracting that. Against white supremacy is approaching the blackness of God, so doing away with the image of the white God. Again, I haven't actually read any of this section, so I'm kind of guessing what she means by these things, but I think they're cool. Instead of misogyny, empowering women, celebrating sexuality, affirming gender diversity. I forgot to change. That's not the one. That's not it. It's not capitalist spirituality. Hang on. The call to action is, no.
Good thing she didn't vote.
Right.
Secular communism.
Transforming capitalism, and I don't know what she means by that, so I'll get back to you when I read that. Belonging to earth and animals, and then breaking the spiral of violence. And I'm actually just gonna change that, So what do any of these calls to action strike you as doable or important in a particular way?
I'll be honest and say that I'm very uncomfortable with the violence that's the idea that I was one of those people who went to the polls and helped the candidates, and I also did the work for getting people registered and that type of thing. I'm too scared to. I'm just too scared to. I'm afraid to even put a sign on my yard. And boy, 2 years ago, was it 2 years ago or 16? I don't remember, but
Not too recently.
yeah,
Recently.
yeah, we had great, all of the signs out there in numbers. This time, I'm afraid to have Sherry Beasley's sign on my yard. Because we are, our area in which we live, the majority of the people around us are Republicans. And they have told us, and people with holding their guns and having guns on their, it scares me.
You should have seen the reaction when my Pete Buttigieg for president signed.
Yeah, that was really interesting. I loved it. We had it out there.
So when you think about that, think about the voices that are being raised. So think about those of us who are teachers, educators, healthcare workers. We are basically advised to keep our opinions and our thoughts to ourselves because of our position and because of what we do, and because, we want everyone to come to us, to feel safe, to trust us. But then when you think about those voices that are being silenced, those opinions that are being squelched, and those thoughts, it's just, think about that.
I used to speak all the time.
And now
I have trouble speaking, which is a bit of.
and it's not just because of fear, it's because of who you are and who you want people to come, you want everyone to feel free to come to you, to be comfortable with you and who you are. But then on the other side of that is those are the voices and those are the opinions who do not hold the microphone.
That's true. Thank you.
I'm in the same boat with you, because Jay, we were early voting 2 years ago, and after all this crap,
I couldn't sign up for it this year. Jay's working it, and it makes me really anxious that something could happen in one of the polling places in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. So it keeps you from participating fully and speaking out.
Well, and in 2020, I was a poll watcher, and I did that because of there were concerns that Black voters were going to be intimidated, and I felt like I can be there to watch. And there weren't any issues, but it is. Yeah, this is all complicated because I feel like we as a nation struggle to talk about anything that we disagree on. And you will hear people on the other side say that their opinions cannot be voiced either, right? And so what do we do with that breakdown where we aren't good at talking about these things, especially across lines of difference? We aren't good at acknowledging the power differentials in many of these conversations.
I feel like there's this consistent narrative where, like, both sides of the aisle will result in violence, but it's violence against property usually when people on the left, some it's definitely the one, I'm sure, Austin and whatnot, but people are more concerned with vandalism than they are with, like, human lives.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely think there's a dichotomy there that's not acknowledged.
Yeah.
I wanted to say something maybe a little contrary to what's been said. When I was in high school, I had a Southern history teacher, he was my U.S. history teacher, and he still was mourning the decline of the Confederacy. And at one point, he started to make his opinion clear about what he thought about miscegenation. And so I was very offended, and I went to my counselor and told him I was offended. And my counselor was very surprised that this teacher had thought it was appropriate in 1964 to say what he thought about this subject, because it really was not relevant to teaching American history, although maybe it was. Anyway, so he was not disciplined, but I was moved into another class. And it works both ways. I mean, he was expressing his opinion, and that's part of who he was. And I was offended. And I was a student, and I think as a student, I had a right to be offended. I had a right to complain. And of course, now it might be a conservative student would complain. But, I mean, it's out there, this is not a new problem. I'm talking about 1964. And teachers will express opinions, and they can give offense, and students have a right to complain.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I want to dwell on this too long. I do think it's important for us to be able to name when opinions are not just offensive, but produce harm and violence, especially towards marginalized groups. I think that's actually really important to be able to name. But I don't know. I think I might be interested to hear more of what y'all think in a church setting. How does this play out, and how does this work? Y'all will never hear me tell you who I'm voting for, promote any political party or candidate. I will never do it around a church person or from the pulpit, because I just feel strongly that that's not my place. I will talk about what's happening in the world. I will talk about what's happening in politics. And it's hard for me. I don't always know that I'm getting it right, because I do believe, there's some people that say, me talking about social justice issues is me being too political. But the personal is political. The church is supposed to be engaged in politics. But finding that line of being engaged, working for justice through systems of government and otherwise, is different from establishing Christianity as a religion. Yeah, what do y'all think just about how we engage with this in church, and how do we resist white Christian nationalism as Christians, especially those of us who are white?
What I hear in the calls to action is just love. And I think that in any movement, if the call is for love, then that's the center. So if you're talking about race, if you're talking about gender, capitalism, everything, the line, where you draw the line is it loving, and what are the motives, and I think loving precludes judgment. You can discern all you want to and decide what's right for you, but putting yourself, like she says, embody humility, putting yourself above someone else is not the loving thing to do, but empowering each other is. And so in the church, if the motive for our seeking justice is because we are loving, and not because we want a certain political power to be party to be in power, then I think that's the dividing line.
I think, and this hasn't really come up in this particular book when they're talking about racism. It seems to be talking more about anti-Black racism, but the Christian nationalist movement was really founded with anti-Semitism. That's to say it doesn't, but that really needs to be named, especially if we're talking about a church context, because we perpetuate that in ways that we don't even realize just by the normal things that we do every week. So being more conscious of that is something we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Pointing out that Jesus was Jewish
Yes.
might be an appropriate step here.
Yeah.
I think that when I talk to my students, so I teach civil rights and liberties, and one of the cases we just looked at was, I think it's Kennedy versus Bramerman, but this is where the football coach prayed on the 50-yard line. And so I asked my first period class, what do you think, was this proper? And overwhelmingly, the class thought that he was proper, like that this was appropriate. And even I have a student in there who's Muslim, and he said, I want my right to exercise my freedom to be protected, and I feel like this was a free exercise. I was trying to get them to say, is this free exercise or is this establishment, right? And so is it the establishment clause or is it the free exercise clause of the Constitution? And many of them felt like it was free exercise. But what they couldn't get, in my opinion, was the power dynamic of the coach over the students. And as students, they thought they had all of this agency. And I was like, but if your coach who is putting you on the playing field is doing a particular thing, you feel like you can stand up to that coach? And they all were like, yeah, we don't do anything that we don't believe in. And I think they're lying to themselves. But like, it was just very interesting to me, and not even, like, I don't even think it was politically oriented, but it was very interesting to me that they did not see this. And part of it is, I think, like, even when I talked about the school calendar, like the fact that we are not in school on Saturday and Sunday, or the fact that we get out of school, they call it winter break, but it is around holidays that the majority of people in the South practice. Like, if you lived in a different place, you would possibly have Jewish holidays that you are off. I think that it's part of that norm of the Christian majority's frame of reference that's hard to break out of. Like, particularly if this is all you lived in and this is all you know. Which I also probably encompass a lot of the Christian ideals because I grew up in that type of environment. So I find it to be, I think it would just be, as I think about the calls to action, I think knowledge is really important. Just knowledge of other people who are not like yourself or who are different from yourself. is such an important thing.
Although I would say that's the whole point, is that when I was in school, Jewish kids they were, it was an uninfused league when they were offering Yom Kippur. And they had to learn how to sing Christmas carols. And the idea was that we had, the school had to demonstrate to the community that there was no diversity. And that was along with, segregation in the city. So it was almost like the mission of the school to show the community that we were all the same when we weren't. Of course, there are still people, that's what they want. And there are people who say, no, we're not all the same and we want diversity. I don't think that there's any way to reconcile those two. I think they're just different kinds of people and different kinds of personalities. Some people really do not tolerate diversity. And they often go and live in certain areas like Exeter's where there are other people just like them. And that becomes the norm, and the people who want to live in a more diverse environment come and live in the city. We chose to live in Winston-Salem rather than Clemens because we didn't want to live in a predominantly white city. And I think that that's human nature. That there's some people who really don't tolerate diversity. And I don't know that they can be convinced to be otherwise. You're a minister, you're probably more optimistic.
Oh. I don't know that I am.
I live on the lot from here, and on one side of me, you see this picture?
I do.
On one side of me is Trump supporter for gun rights. And on the other side of me, I came home one night, there were Confederate flags lining the street. I mean, like the sort of space between the sidewalk and the street. Okay, so that particular area. And then it's a clutter, like, right, like, I don't put, and I have the same, I'm not in the suburbs or in Clemens, but I'm in downtown Winston-Salem, and I have a fear of any political, I don't want anybody to know politically who, I mean, clearly you can look at me possibly and know politically who I am, but like, if you think that people are all a particular way, but like, there is some fear that I have around the people that I live around who are very nice, generally. They're very nice to me, but politically, I'm dirt to them, in my opinion. So, I don't know that a city is all, anecdotally, it's not always the city can get you away from.
And I think it's important to, especially again for white Christians, to consider. So one of the things that Carter Hayward talks about in this book is that these are sins that she's not just naming of other people. She's saying this is our collective problem, especially as white American Christians, that we participate in all of these things, and therefore we all get to respond to the calls to action, right? And I can't remember where I was going with that, except just to acknowledge that those sins show up for me, even as I, profess to be striving to be anti-racist white person. They're still very much there, and I get to work on them forever, basically, for myself and for the communities that I'm a part of. Yeah, Tom.
I don't want to be contentious as far as white people in Clemens go. Winston-Salem is a largely diverse, huge neighborhood, and there are, maybe in the city, downtown, but there are certainly plenty of white neighborhoods and subdivisions throughout the western part of Winston-Salem, down at Vista, Sherwood Forest, you name it, there's a ton of them. Now, of course, if you were to tell me that the east Winston, parts of, who like the views?
Well, and it is hard. And I remember now why I started on the collective sin piece, because I had somebody visiting from out of town came to Green Street and was going around the neighborhood and was like, oh, there's so many like pride flags and there's signs in people's yards that say, in this house we believe, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, yeah, no, like, I know a lot of those people, and the sign or the flag doesn't necessarily tell me that they're actually working on their whiteness or their pillar or whatever. And again, I can say that for myself. I got a pride flag on my house. Like, that does not mean that I've got everything all right. And I do think that goes back to the embodying humility piece of acknowledging that the work is ongoing, that we even, I was raised to think that I was a good white liberal and that it was my job to be a good white person, and have come to see that that's not actually helpful to anybody. And, me trying not to be racist, we can talk about how that's problematic in and of itself. That doesn't actually make the world any safer for non-white people or for Jewish people or for anybody who's targeted by white Christian nationalism. And
I guess I like these calls to action as long as we're not thinking that we're going to get rid of white nationalism. Because I think white nationalism is a phenomenon that we don't have a whole lot of control over. And I think it's not surprising that a certain segment of the population is going to go that way. But otherwise, I find this great. And just as long as the goal is not to get rid of white nationalism, because it's just part of the mix. Not a part of the mix that I like, but, I find tasteful. But, it's there, and it's really easy to understand why it's there, and it's just, we have to tolerate it.
Well, I'll agree and I'll push back on it a little bit, because I like the calls to action, although I don't think they would get rid of white nationalism by themselves. But I also feel like white nationalism in the last 50 years has been very intentional about growing itself.
yes.
Very intentional. And if it can be intentional about growing itself, we can be intentional
About resisting.
about our response to it, about trying to diminish it. Because if we don't,
Well, how would this diminish it?
I'm not saying that would.
Oh, okay.
But part of what you were saying was there's nothing we can do to get rid of it. It's always going to be around. I'm saying I don't think those things by themselves would get rid of it. But we need to be somehow working together and thinking together to push back against it, because it will swallow us whole, and that is entirely what they intend to do. In 2016, there were 4 bills that had been passed about Christian nationalism. More than 30 have been passed now, and it's amping up. So, yeah, there's part of me that is worried that what you're saying is right, that fears that maybe we can't get rid of it, that it's already taken root too much. But there's another part of me that's not willing to give in to that. And that if they can be intentional about growing it, we can be intentional about stopping it.
It seems like if we were to be intentional about stopping it, we'd have to understand what is making it grow. And you're right that it's a very well-organized movement and it's got a lot of money behind it. And that can have political force. But there's got to be something else. And it seems to me it's like some people are really uncomfortable with change. Some people are really uncomfortable with diversity. And I don't know how to make people comfortable with those things.
I have a scenario that happened to me this week, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. But a colleague of mine across the hall, so this is short story, and see how you would think about it. To me, it's sort of like there are seeds of this stuff that people don't, I don't think people are intentionally being nationalists, but there are seeds that are so small that then become the thing that blows up. Like you were talking about replacement theory. So I had a colleague and they were talking about our principal, who is a newer principal who is Puerto Rican. And some of my colleagues who are white said, oh, when she hired these new teachers, she was just looking for Latino last names, right? And this one teacher said it was just reverse discrimination, just reverse discrimination. I am not comfortable going back and forth with my colleagues. Like, I need peace in my space. And it bothered me because of all the years that we've had white principals who've hired white colleagues, there has never been this thought that they're only hiring white colleagues, right? And this woman hires two people with Latino last names who may not even identify as Latinx, right? And she is making a Latino school, right? And I think that that little seed is the seed that grows this stuff that turns into white nationalism, like that turns into you're replacing us, that we are being put out. And it's like a perspective that people can't see. And I know I should have called it out. I was protecting myself in this moment, in this week. And I protect myself often in those situations. But then I come home and I'm cringing because I'm thinking this is the stuff that little kids hear, and then they think they need to go take out all of these people at the grocery store, or all of the people at the black church, or the Muslims, or whatever, because they're being replaced, and we're giving credence to it. So I guess part of it is, I guess all of us have some responsibility to speak, and that's the responsibility that I have to take on for myself, to speak some power there. But like, I do think it's like small things that turn into, that become the seeds of something bigger.
Yes.
Also, imagine like other colleagues who are white who sort of share with you. And I feel this like constantly with family and with the people, a few people that I know. Like this tension between like needing to maintain a dialogue with them, even though like I think they're awful people. Like I'm talking about other white people in my orbit, whether family or friends or acquaintances. Like the tension between just wanting to cut them off and say like, you know, I don't need them in my life because they're toxic and awful. Also, I don't want to like show tacit approval of their behavior, but also the need to actually remain in their orbit because they're so cut off from people who think differently than them, because they don't have a check against Fox News. They don't have anybody to fact check them. That they go down this like rabbit hole and become neo-Nazis or whatever. And so I don't know. Like I know I should be more involved with them, but I'm just scared too for all kinds of reasons. But yeah, I definitely feel like that's kind of our responsibility as white people in those situations to engage people in dialogue, even though it's hard.
There, I don't have the name of the book, I was watching a YouTube video this afternoon by the Dean of Union Seminary, who has written a book on the psychology of white nationalism. And her third chapter in that book explores whether and when to engage. And she seemed to be saying that there were times when it absolutely would not be helpful, because these are so tied to identities. But she lays out when it is helpful, right? It helps kind of make some distinctions about when that kind of dialogue can be helpful. So that might be something to look for that YouTube video.
What's the name of the book?
I came across
I thought
it.
it was the psychology of white nationalism, but I just
I'll look it up, but I'll try to find it. And she's from Columbia?
Union
Oh,
Theology.
Union. Okay.
I think you can't really change a mind that doesn't want to be changed. Like, these are good ideals, but by the time you get to the point where they're identifying white nationalists, they've already strongly formed their opinions. And the only way you solve it at that point is to find out why they did have those opinions in the first place, what drove them to it. I think what you're seeing happening in the Florida school systems is one way those opinions form in the first place. You take out all kinds of diversity, you take out any mention of a history that is even remotely distasteful for children to learn about, and they grow up with ideals that are the exact opposite of the things on that list, and by the time they're all grown up, you can't change those minds.
Yeah, people's opinions, some people's opinions never change, but you can change the political culture, the social culture over time. And, one thing I think of is, pulling on miscegenation, which had, broad support before the 1960s, but has relatively little support at this point. And anti-Semitism, as vicious as it currently could be, was pervasive as late as the 1940s, and gets reduced. So people, some of the things you were talking about, and with the issue of when is the moment and how do you do it, but that's part of what has to happen, is that people have to be willing to speak up, and that can help change the political culture, even if it doesn't change everybody's mind.
One thing I thought about with when is it right to engage or not, I've heard about one of my favorite pastors who actually wrote a book called The Myth of the Christian Nation, but his view is more about Christian nationalism inside the church and what it's doing to the church, to the country. But anyways, it's a good book. He thinks very boy, and he talks a lot about how to argue without arguing, and how to listen with compassion. But basically, in your brain, when you are confronted with change or confronted with something that you don't agree with, your amygdala can be activated, it's fight or flight, and what happens when that happens is that your rational brain gets shut down, and so that's when you get red in the face, and you start sweating, and you get visible, there's your facial expression changes, and you cannot hear what the person is saying. That's why I always tell couples, stay 20 minutes and let the chemicals go. So he says, if you're centered in love, and then you are listening to understand and with compassion, not letting your fight or flight response get the better of you, then you're in a position to have a dialogue. And he said there's a couple things that can counteract that shutting down of the rational brain. One is gratitude, and the other is curiosity. So you can put yourself in a position of being curious, to ask questions and to open it. Hey, it's my opinion, and I'm going to show you who's right. So basics of it too.
I think that's
What?
a great point. I think there's an art or an act to asking a thought-provoking question that is not necessarily confrontational, but just with the spirit or the intent of, well, let's think about that,
Yeah, that's why, when I say be in dialogue, I guess I mean be in relationship with them.
Yes.
Not I don't talk to them because they're Republican. I feel like the people whose minds change, it's organic. It's because you're in a relationship with them, and yeah, you might fight, but if you're in a marriage or whatever, you part ways for a bit and you come back together because they're in your orbit. You just talk to them, your friends or whatever. So that's, I think, what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about seeing someone on Facebook say something in some area and each actually, I don't think that's productive to engage strangers, but to be in relationship with people is.
Yeah, relationship, curiosity, questions, and stories. I mean, this is how Jesus operated, right? This is how Jesus encountered people and models for us to do. And I've got my own stories of people who we strongly disagreed about things that are really important to me and to this church, and we've stayed in relationship, and they come here sometimes, and that's great.
To the point of Don, is that your name, Don?
Mike.
Mike.
I don't know where I got that one.
Oh,
all you white guys. Mike's point about you can change the culture, I'm certainly glad that the issues that we have come so far on, we did not say, well, it's just gonna be around and you're not gonna be able to change. You know, we have made some progress in our culture at times on this
Oh, go ahead.
Isn't it amazing? I wonder how this happened and how we got here from 2016. So, you know, the power of one individual in poisoning the environment. Yeah, and there's not an answer to that. That's just to ponder how that can happen, that one individual can.
Well, I would argue pretty strongly that that is a symptom and not a cause. And if we go back and look at the dates on some of these shootings, 2012.
Can I make a cautionary statement? There was a gentleman about 10 years ago in this area who complained about a Christian flag in a veteran's cemetery. It's a federal cemetery, so it was illegal that it was there. He complained about it, and he annoyed the people who lived in the area so much that they ended up breaking up his marriage, and he was forced to leave the state of North Carolina. And the last time I saw him, he was absolutely beside himself, that he felt abandoned, he felt persecuted. The people that were offended by his speaking up were very aggressive and nasty. And so I would always be cautious, in political engagement with these people, because it can be really nasty.
Well, and two things to kind of reiterate: relationship. So I'm not advocating go up to a random person you don't know and argue with them about this. And again, I want to bring it back to us. I'm always going to be the person telling us that, like, we Green Street, especially like white Green Streeters, we need to be doing this work on ourselves too. Our minds and hearts need changing too, and we don't get to approach people with a superiority complex about any of this. Yeah, because there's a lot of this kind of stuff that I grew up taking really for granted, even in like a more liberal church space. There's a lot that just wasn't examined for me that I had to work on during life. Anyway, here are some books, very cheerful books. I have not read all of. I've read those. This guy, he's the pastor at First Baptist, or God, I keep calling it First Baptist, Myers Park Baptist in Charlotte. He was at Wake Forest Divinity yesterday preaching, and I missed it. And I'm sad. Anyway, so there's some more things. And this series is over, but we're going to look at our new logo for our anniversary. Isn't this cool? John Hyland did that for us. So we've got the next 2 weeks worship, fellowship, and service stuff happening. And we hope that y'all will join us for that. And we'll probably we haven't quite nailed down what we're doing during Advent, formation-wise, but in the new year, we'll probably do another series kind of like this. So if you have things that you want to talk more about in this kind of space, let us know. And we'll consider. We probably could do a whole series on each one of these topics. Yeah.
Could you go back to the previous